It was a cold, damp evening when he stumbled upon the thing that would change his life forever. The kind of evening where the air feels heavy, like it's pressing down on your chest, and every sound seems amplified in the stillness. He had been walking through the woods near his small cabin, a place he'd called home for years. It wasn't unusual for him to take these walks, especially after dark. Something about the quiet solitude helped clear his mind. But this night was different. The forest floor was littered with fallen leaves, their crisp edges crunching underfoot as he moved deeper into the trees. A faint mist hung low, curling around the base of ancient oaks and twisting through the underbrush like ghostly fingers. The moonlight filtered weakly through the canopy above, casting long shadows that danced unnaturally across the ground. He wasn't sure what drew him off the path. It could have been curiosity or just a gut feeling, but something compelled him to step away from the familiar trail and into the unknown. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from, and what time is it there? He didn't notice the object at first. It blended so seamlessly with its surroundings, almost as if it were part of the earth itself. But then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw Ita glint, a flash of something unnatural amidst the decay. At first, he thought it might be an animal skull, perhaps left behind by some predator who had dragged its meal here to feast undisturbed. But as he knelt down and brushed away the dirt and moss, his blood ran cold. This was no ordinary bone. It was too smooth, too polished, and there was something else about it. Something wrong. When he picked it up, the weight of it felt strange in his hands, heavier than it should have been. And then he heard it, the scream. It wasn't loud, not at first, but it grew louder, more insistent, until it filled his ears and seemed to reverberate inside his skull. It wasn't human, not exactly, but it carried a raw, primal anguish that made his stomach churn. For a moment, he froze, unable to move, unable to breathe. His heart pounded in his chest as the sound echoed all around him, bouncing off the trees and swallowing the silence whole. "What the hell is this?" he whispered aloud, though no one was there to answer. He turned the skull over in his hands, examining it closely. Its surface was marred by strange markings, symbols carved deep into the bone that looked older than time itself. They weren't random. They formed patterns, almost like writing, though he couldn't decipher them. The longer he stared at them, the more they seemed to shift and writhe beneath his gaze, as if alive. He quickly looked away, shaking his head to dispel the unsettling sensation. For reasons he couldn't explain, he didn't leave the skull there. Maybe it was morbid curiosity. Maybe it was the nagging feeling that it belonged with him now, but whatever the reason, he slipped it into his coat pocket and continued back toward his cabin. The walk home felt longer than usual, each step heavier than the last. The scream had stopped once he put the skull away, but the memory of it lingered, clinging to him like a shadow. Back at the cabin, he placed the skull on the kitchen table and stared at it under the dim light of a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. The room felt smaller somehow, suffocating, as if the walls were closing in. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, hoping the burn would steady his nerves, but it did little to calm the unease gnawing at the edges of his mind. He tried to rationalize what he'd found a freak accident, a cruel joke played by someone with too much time on their hands, but deep down, he knew it was more than that. That night, he dreamed. Or maybe it wasn't a dream. In the haze between sleep and waking, he saw felt her presence. She was there, standing in the corner of the room, watching him with hollow eyes that burned with rage and sorrow. Her mouth moved, but no words came out, only that same piercing scream that had haunted him earlier. He woke drenched in sweat, his pulse racing, convinced he wasn't alone. When he turned to look at the table, the skull was facing him directly, its empty sockets boring into his soul. Days passed, though they blurred together in a haze of paranoia and exhaustion. He stopped going into town, stopped answering calls from friends who wondered why he'd suddenly gone silent. Sleep eluded him, replaced by restless nights where he sat awake, staring at the skull and waiting for something ending to happen. And yet, nothing did. Not at first. Then came the whispers. Faint at first, barely audible over the wind outside his window, but growing clearer with each passing day. They spoke in a language he didn't understand, voices overlapping in a cacophony of despair and fury. Sometimes they sounded pleading, other times accusatory, but always urgent, as if trying to convey some dire warning. He tried covering the skull with a cloth, stuffing it in a drawer, even burying it in the yard, but it always reappeared on the table by morning, untouched and unyielding. One evening, driven to the brink of madness, he decided to confront the source of the whispers. Armed with a flashlight and a hammer he didn't think would do much good, he returned to the spot in the woods where he'd found the skull. The journey felt shorter this time, as if the forest wanted him to arrive quickly. When he reached the clearing, he dug frantically, clawing at the earth with his bare hands until his fingers bled. He didn't know what he expected to find: a body, a grave, answers, but when his shovel struck something solid, his heart skipped a beat. Beneath the soil lay the remains of a woman, her bones brittle and yellowed with age. Her jaw was missing, which explained the scream he'd heard emanating from the skull. But it was the necklace around her neck that caught his attention, a crude pendant bearing the same symbols etched into the bone. As he touched it, images flooded his mind. Fire, screams, betrayal. He saw flashes of a village burning, of people running in terror, of a woman being dragged into the woods and left to die. The visions were overwhelming, and he collapsed to his knees, gasping for air. When he came to, he realized the truth. This woman had been murdered, her death shrouded in mystery and forgotten by time. The skull wasn't just a relic, it was a vessel, a conduit for her pain and anger. She wanted justice, closure, something only he could provide. But how? How could he possibly undo centuries of suffering? Over the next few weeks, he became obsessed with uncovering the truth. He scoured old records, visited local historians, and pieced together fragments of a story that had been buried along with the woman. What he discovered chilled him to the core. The symbols on the skull matched those used by a secret sect known for practicing dark rituals. They believed that sacrificing the innocent would grant them power, immortality. The woman, whose name he eventually learned was Eleanor, had been one such victim. Armed with this knowledge, he returned to the clearing one final time. Under the light of the full moon, he performed a ritual of his own, using the information he'd gathered to lay Eleanor's spirit to rest. He spoke words of apology, of regret, promising that her story would not be forgotten. And then, as dawn broke over the horizon, the screaming stopped. The skull crumbled to dust in his hands, leaving behind only silence. But peace never truly comes without a price. Though the nightmares ceased and the whispers faded, he couldn't shake the feeling that he'd merely delayed the inevitable. Somewhere, deep within the woods, the earth stirred again, ready to reveal another secret, another tragedy waiting to be uncovered. It all began on a night when the air was thick with humidity, the kind that clings to your skin and makes every breath feel heavy. The moon hung low in the sky, obscured by clouds that drifted lazily across its pale face. He had been driving through the countryside for hours, the monotony of the road broken only by the occasional flicker of headlights in his rearview mirror or the distant hoot of an owl. His destination wasn't clear. He just knew he needed to keep moving. Life back home had become suffocating, a series of arguments and disappointments that left him feeling like a stranger in his own world. So he packed a bag, got into his car, and drove. The town he found himself in was small, almost forgotten. It wasn't marked on any map he'd seen, and the sign at the edge of the road was weathered and cracked, the letters barely legible. But something about it drew him in a pull he couldn't explain, as though the place itself were calling to him. The streets were empty, lined with old brick buildings that leaned slightly as if weary from years of standing. There was a diner still open, its neon sign buzzing faintly in the darkness, and he decided to stop there, hoping for a cup of coffee and maybe some answers. Inside, the diner smelled of grease and stale cigarette smoke. A few patrons sat scattered around the room, their faces shadowed by the dim light of overhead bulbs. The waitress who approached him was older, her hair streaked with gray and pulled back into a tight bun. She didn't smile as she set a menu down in front of him, but there was a kindness in her eyes that made him feel less alone. He ordered coffee and asked if she knew of any places to stay for the night. She hesitated before answering, glancing over her shoulder toward the kitchen. "There's a bed and breakfast up the road," she said finally, her voice low and cautious. "But I wouldn't recommend it." "Why not?" he asked, leaning forward slightly. She shook her head, avoiding his gaze. "Bad things happen there. People go missing. Or worse." He laughed nervously, dismissing her words as superstition. After all, what harm could come from spending one night in a strange house? He thanked her and paid for his coffee, then followed her vague directions until he reached the bed and breakfast. From the outside, it looked harmless enough, an old Victorian-style house with peeling paint and a sagging porch. The windows were dark, save for a single light glowing faintly upstairs. He knocked on the door, and after a moment, it creaked open to reveal an elderly man with sunken eyes and a gaunt frame. The man introduced himself as Mr. Grayson and welcomed him inside without much enthusiasm. The interior was cluttered with antiques, their surfaces coated in a fine layer of dust. The air smelled musty, like decades of memories trapped within the walls. Mr. Grayson showed him to a room on the second floor, apologizing for the lack of amenities. "We don't get many visitors these days," he muttered before leaving him alone. That's when he noticed the ring. It was sitting on the bedside table, gleaming faintly in the dim light. At first glance, it seemed ordinary, a simple silver band with intricate engravings along the surface. But as he picked it up, he felt an odd sensation, a tingling in his fingertips that spread up his arm. The engravings weren't random designs. They formed symbols, ancient and unfamiliar. Something about them stirred a deep unease within him, yet he couldn't bring himself to put the ring down. Curiosity got the better of him. He slipped it onto his finger, half expecting nothing to happen, but the moment the metal touched his skin, the temperature in the room plummeted. His breath came out in visible puffs, and the shadows in the corners seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally. A cold wind swept through the room, though the windows remained closed. And then he heard a low, guttural growl that seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere all at once. Panic gripped him, and he yanked the ring off, tossing it onto the table as if it were burning hot. The sensation passed almost immediately, leaving him shaken but unharmed. He told himself it was just his imagination playing tricks on him, the result of exhaustion and stress. Still, he resolved to leave the ring where it lay and avoid touching it again. He climbed into bed, pulling the covers tightly around him, and tried to sleep. But sleep wouldn't come. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw flashes of red light and heard whispers in a language he didn't understand. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they became a deafening roar that filled the entire room. He snapped awake, drenched in sweat, and realized the ring was glowing faintly on the table. Against his better judgment, he reached for it again, unable to resist the pull it exerted on him. This time, the transformation was immediate. The room dissolved into darkness, and he found himself standing in a vast, desolate landscape. The sky above was a swirling mass of crimson clouds, and the ground beneath his feet was cracked and barren. In the distance, a figure emerged from the haze, a towering creature with eyes like molten gold and horns that curved upward like scythe blades. Its presence radiated malice, and he felt his knees buckle under the weight of its gaze. "You called me," the creature said, its voice resonating like thunder. "What do you seek?" He stammered, unsure of how to respond. He hadn't meant to summon anything. He hadn't even known such a thing was possible. But the demon didn't wait for an explanation. It stepped closer, its massive form casting a long shadow over him. "The ring binds us," it continued. "You wear it, and I am yours to command. But beware, such power comes at a cost." Before he could ask what that cost might be, the vision faded, and he was back in the bedroom gasping for air. The ring was still on his finger, warm now, almost comforting. For a brief moment, he considered throwing it away, burying it somewhere no one would ever find it. But another part of him, the darker, more reckless part, was intrigued. What kind of power could he wield with this artifact? Could he use it to fix the mess his life had become? Over the next several days, he experimented cautiously, testing the limits of the ring's abilities. Each time he invoked the demon, it appeared instantly, eager to grant his wishes. He started small, asking for trivial things: a winning lottery ticket, a promotion at work, revenge against someone who had wronged him. The results were immediate and undeniable. Money flowed into his bank account. Opportunities presented themselves effortlessly, and those who had crossed him suffered mysterious misfortune. But with each wish, the toll became clearer. Strange occurrences began to plague him: objects moving on their own, shadows shifting when no one was near, voices whispering his name in the dead of night. The demon's presence lingered, even when it wasn't summoned, watching him with unseen eyes. He tried to ignore it, convincing himself that the benefits outweighed the risks. But deep down, he knew he was playing a dangerous game. One evening, as he sat alone in his hotel room, the whispers returned. They were louder now, more urgent, urging him to make another wish. He resisted at first, determined not to give in to temptation, but the pressure mounted until he couldn't bear it anymore. Desperation took hold, and he called upon the demon once again. "What is it you desire?" it asked, its golden eyes gleaming with amusement. "I want control," he blurted out. "I want to be free of you, free of this curse."